Hello, everybody. This is my presentation on the Battle of Tarawa by Chaseton Sullivan, me. In 1941, after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. has entered World War II and started the war in the Pacific. Overall, it's a very different war than the other allies in Europe, with England um, and Russia. They're completely different. Um, the main Allied strategy in the war in the Pacific was island hopping, and it was a huge reason why the Allies won in the Pacific. The total idea of island hopping was the U.S. would skip heavily fortified islands to only capture locations like air bases and supply depots. The heavy fortified islands were cut off from their supply lines, destroying them without direct infiltration. This therefore saves troops, supplies, time. It's overall just better. Um, the terrain is completely different than any other fronts that are happening in World War II right now. The terrain in the Pacific favored the Japanese overall. Heavy jungle islands were very hard to fight in. Very hot conditions with the sun burning and the humidity made it terrible for anybody on the island. Temps could get over 100 and the humidity almost 90%. So you can imagine just being in a swamp. It would not be fun, especially trying to fight in that. The islands were volcanic islands, so they were very rugged and pretty hard to navigate. So they were very rocky, very weird landscapes. Soldiers had a lot to deal with in the Pacific with difficult war, but also they had to deal with different illnesses at the time. So the main one in the Pacific was malaria. So this disease thrives in wet, swampy conditions. And those were the perfect conditions for malaria to spread. So these conditions also were a breeding ground for mosquitoes that would spread the disease. Symptoms are a lot like the flu, with high temps and chills. With malaria being pretty common in the Pacific, it could turn a full battle ready soldier into a bedridden situation very quickly, and it happens very quickly, like within 12 hours to 24 hours. So a couple battles just leading up to Tarawa. I think it's just kind of important to know what's going on before the main focus of this presentation. So some major victories that led up to it. Firstly, the Battle of the Coral Sea, which was widely considered the U.S. Navy's first big victory and was considered a turning point in the Pacific front for the U.S. So the Japanese suffered heavy losses in important categories, like their whole naval fleet. They had a very big dent in it. And this battle let the Allies really turn from a defensive state of mind to an offensive state of mind. So, and then this battle also let the U.S. get a good foothold in the Pacific and really try to figure out how to strategize and figure out how to fight in the new front because they don't have a lot of experience with this kind of stuff. So the next major battle the U.S. won was the Battle of Midway, and it was a naval battle where the U.S. inflicted heavy damage on the Japan's fleet using planes to attack ships. Really helped the U.S. claim victory and weaken the Japanese fleet. The U.S. had broken the Japanese code and could understand what they were communicating. So this helps the U.S. tremendously with figure out what they're doing and try to counterattack. When the U.S. won, they patrolled the area after to make sure that all the Japanese left so then they can really focus on what's next. Another important event leading up to the Battle of Tarawa was the Guadalcanal campaign, which is also known as Operation Watchtower, is how I know it. So it was a significant land and naval battles around the Solomon Islands. So the purpose was to capture an important airfield on the island. This is very common throughout the war in the Pacific, with capturing important islands, mainly just like airfields that advances the war for the U.S. more. So this exact airfield threatened supply routes to Australia and New Zealand. So this operation was considered the first major Allied offensive against the Japanese forces. I think these battles were important because it kind of led up to the Battle of Tarawa and set the stage for the Pacific War. And it's nice to know the background purposes for this presentation, kind of know what stage the war's at. And I think it's just important to know what happened right before and kind of know what's happening. So in November 1943, the U.S. invaded the Japanese, which held the Gilbert Islands. This was part of the Allied island hopping strategy. The invasion was part of the Operation Galvanic, which the overall objective was to invade and capture the Gilbert Islands. The Gilbert Islands include the islands of Bacanari, Mankin, and Betito. Mankin and Betito were the most important out of the three islands, and these islands were a big stepping stone in the war. The Battle of Tarawa took place on Betito Island before the battle. The U.S. needed to map out the island and kind of get to know the island before they invaded it. The U.S. military was a huge part in getting information for the initial assault for the island. Missions included aerial shots of the island, trying to get important information on enemy positions, like kind of getting to know where the heavily fortified places were, like with pillboxes and trenches and kind of the more important side. It also let them try to get like the terrain of the island and kind of with like the hills and kind of know where you can get a foothold on the island. So this is the island. They invaded from the north coast. There's 3 beaches that they nicknamed Red 1, Red 2, Red 3, and then there's also the Green Beach on the west side. So these are the like two main sides that they invaded on. It kind of just gives you a visual of what they were looking at too. So this one is a little bit of a better picture. So the green beach right there on the west side, and then the 3 beaches up there. It kind of just gives you a good look of how it is a small island, but also with that airstrip, it really is vital to capture this island. With limited naval and aerial intelligence about the well-fortified island, the Allies were not fully confident in invading the island. The Japanese had a well-prepared and very fortified defenses. Some of these defenses were well-prepared bunkers, connecting tunnels, barbed wire to defend the airfield. The Japanese had large caliber coast defensive guns. Heavy aircraft and dual-purpose guns were used to defend the coast. Barricades and landmines were also put on the beach to slow the opposition of the invasion. But overall, the Japanese used the natural contours of the island, like little like sand hills or like a little hill, and try to get like the higher ground. They were pretty smart about how they set these things up with the shooting lanes, and really just it was a good defensive state of mind that the Japanese were in. Overall, Bonito Island was a very important step to control the air in the Pacific. So, with the island hopping strategy, the more airfields you get, the farther your planes can go in the Pacific. So, then the farther you can go because you have to come back. So, this was a good stepping stone to get further in the Pacific. Even with limited information, the Allies really need to invade this island and take it. Even with many strong defenses, Bonito Island was a much needed step for the Allies in the Pacific War and part of the island hopping strategy. Excuse me. Many workers were used to create these defenses on Bonito Island. 1,000 Japanese construction workers and 1,200 Korean forced laborers. So that's a lot of people on a pretty small island. They created pillboxes to make clear shooting lanes for the invading enemies, let's say like on a beach. This would make it extremely hard for Marines coming off transport boats to get a foothold on the beach because they're just sitting ducks in them wide open, and there's someone in a pillbox with a machine gun. It would just make it really hard to get a foothold on the island and kind of go from there, because that's probably the most important step, is just getting on the island. This one gives you a little bit better of a like invasion plan for them. So you can see the reef's edge too. That'll be important in a second. And then there was 4 places they invaded, and it kind of just gives you a better representation of like where. On November 20th, approximately 35,000 troops from the U.S. 2nd Marine Division and the Army's 27th Infantry Division began amphibious assaults on Bonito Island. So that's kind of just giving you a gauge of how many people invaded. By November 1943, more than 2,500 Japanese soldiers defended it. So most of the soldiers in Gilbert Island, so the 3 islands, were stationed there. So that kind of shows you how important the airfield was to both sides, that they put this much manpower into such a small island. On the morning of November 20th at about 5 a.m., the first shots were fired from American ships. There was so much rapid firepower from the ships that it looked to some like machine gun burst. So it was just all out assault on the island. Also, there was an aerial assault called in with no discernible resistance from the ground. So they really didn't see much resistance from the island back to the naval assault. Um, After the Marines witnessed the heavy fire, many concluded that there would be little left of the enemy. So it kind of degrades their it kind of inflates their confidence that this little island should be easy to take, and they'll realize that it's not at all. So waves the first wave of Marines approached Benito's northern shore in transfer boats. They had a minor issue with the tide being lower than they had thought. It's actually really not minor. It's actually huge, and this probably costed a lot of lives on this little simple mistake. So, with the tide being lower than they thought, they were stuck 500 yards out from the shore. So, they had to ditch their transfer boats. And as soon as they ditched their transfer boats, they were under heavy Japanese fire. This was a huge mistake going in on low tide, and this is probably one of their most costly mistakes in this battle. The Marines had quickly realized that the enemy had not been neutralized, and they were still very strong presence. This heavy fire destroyed crafts before the Marines could even disembark from them. So the first wave of Marines made their way through the water to the beach, but only a few managed to get to shore, with them being sitting ducks in the wide open, running through the water. After realizing that the Japanese had a much larger force than anticipated, the Americans sent out more men in an effort to establish a beachhead. Still on day one, the Japanese had lost their communications, but because how fierce the Japanese fought, they had to die in honor. So it was either die in battle or commit suicide. So with that determination, they fought extremely hard against the Americans. The Japanese dispatched also a seaplane with bombs under its wings to attack the assault craft caught on the reef. So that single aircraft became a big asset to the Japanese because it easily dropped bombs on the sitting ducks below. So it was really just like free bomb hits. And they caused a lot of damage with that one seaplane. Still day one, with reinforcements, they managed to secure part of the beach only 100 yards long and 20 feet in the water's edge. It was a big stepping stone for the Allies in the battle, but overall, the first day went extremely bad, and it was really costly for underestimating the enemy. Them being caught on the tide costed a lot of lives and made this battle much more difficult than it should have been. As you can see, them evacuating the wounded on that inflatable boat. So, coming in on day two at 6 a.m. on November 21st, three three Marine battalions that were holding a small area of the beach around the Bonito coast were ordered to fire at the Japanese. This was to cover the incoming Marines entering the battle. So only 450 made it out of 800. So that's kind of just showing you how costly it was just getting on the island, that almost half of them died. But the 450 that made it on the island fought extremely hard to get to the airfield, and they were successful in taking and continuing the fight for the island. Still entering day two, as the morning tide began to rise, landing crafts were able to pass over the reef and bring in many tanks. These tanks rolled in on the beach and fired directly at the pillboxes that had been giving Marines so much trouble. The Marines have the greatest success on the western beach, the green beach that I had showed you earlier on the left side, where naval gunfire enabled the Marines to quickly secure land. When the Marines began to advance east the second day, supported by two borrowed Sherman tanks, Japanese machine gun nests slowed the advance. It was very brutal and non-stop fighting. As you can see, that is a lot of fallen soldiers, and you can just tell, like, the tank in the water. It's just very brutal and a very difficult fight on this for this little island. Uh, Now entering day three, the Allies needed to end this battle and take the island. The Major's first battalion and the 6th Marines fought very hard from the southern shore. They destroyed many of the remaining fortifications and wiped out numerous pillboxes. The main attacks for the remainder of the day were enemy snipers and the remaining pillboxes that had been giving them so much trouble the day before. So these pillboxes were set up probably on a hill, and they probably took a lot of lives with them. That same third night, the Japanese troops made one final attack on the 6th Marines as a last-ditch effort. They were using a Benazi-style counterattack against the Marines. So this style of attack was an all-out assault that they would try their hardest to thwart Allies' plans or the number of troops. If they did not take any enemy territory, or if they did not take an honorary death, they would, if they hadn't taken an honorary death in battle, they would commit suicide. So that kind of just shows you this all-out plan to really just last-ditch effort to really not even get the island back, but to kill as many as Americans as they really can. So the most common way to commit suicide was by grenade, and they would probably unclip the grenade and run at a U.S. troop, so someone could go down with them. The Marines were able to hold off the attack for a while, but when they radioed for reinforcements, they were told that they would not get them. The Marines were barely able to hold their positions against the charging waves of soldiers. Uh, the Japanese then launched a second, third, and then a fourth Bizani charge. So imagine just waves of soldiers not caring if they died or not, trying to kill you. It would be like zombies. So in that, if you can imagine yourself in that position, it would be absolutely terrifying. These waves of soldiers whose only goal is to kill you and they don't care if they got killed in the process. They would fight their hardest until their last breath. So even if you injure one, they're still going to come after you. This would be very scary to go against in battle, especially knowing that you're not going to get reinforcements. So it's only you and the group that you have currently with you. It would be like a zombie horde coming at you, which would be very scary. Although these attacks failed, there was still a small amount of Japanese men or soldiers on the island. The only men left to fight were scattered Japanese snipers and a few dazed and confused defenders that still thought that they were probably winning the war or winning the battle. The remaining Japanese resistance on Benito consisted of small pockets on the island's eastern side, so way on that skinny little strip. The Marines, with the support from the tanks and aircraft and artillery, and a handful of bulldozers, methodically reduced the remaining defensive positions. So they did this very, very slowly on day 3, and just made sure that they eradicated all opposition from the island. By early afternoon on November 23rd, American lines reached the eastern tip of Benito, and the island was declared secure. Isolated groups of Japanese continued to appear in the weeks throughout the battle, except for 147 prisoners, most of them Korean laborers, and the entire Japanese force had been wiped out. So, with the Japanese style of fighting, they're not gonna be taken prisoner because it's either you die in combat or you kill yourself. So, probably all of the Japanese soldiers had died. So that's just a lot of death toll for the Japanese. But the aftermath of the battle was very brutal and was a 3-day battle of hell. 3,636 Japanese in the garrison, but only one officer and 16 enlisted men survived. So only 17 people survived out of almost 4,000. And then also of the Korean laborers, the 1,200, almost all of them also died. So only 129 survived. But overall, 4,690 of the island's defenders were killed. Like I said earlier, overall, the all or nothing Japanese mindset made for a lot of deaths on both ends of the battle. So, just really, this mindset really just costed both sides so many deaths because it's either you're getting killed or killing as many people as you can and you don't care if you die. Very, very honestly sad. Of the 1,021 U.S. personnel killed during the Battle of Tarawa, approximately 350 remain unaccounted for. This they have burial grounds on the island, but many of the missing Marines were probably killed during the first day of the assault. So when they probably opened up those transports, they probably were shot and then either drifted overboard and probably were drifted out to sea, or like with tide, or like something ate them, or something, or a body's like unrecognizable that it's been like decomposing. It is likely they were killed by artillery or machine gun fire while still in transfer boats while waiting to shore. So you can kind of just see how kind of sad that is. Most of the Marines killed on land, and a handful of those recovered from the lagoon were buried in isolated graves or cemeteries around Bonito. So this is one of them. This is on Bonito Island, and it's kind of just a sad little cemetery. Kind of shows you this is one of many of the 1,000 whatever killed in the battle. When the word of heavy casualties soon reached the U.S., the public was stunned by the number of American lives lost in the taking of such a tiny island. High losses couldn't be processed by the public for seemingly an unimportant island, so the public didn't really get how important this island was in the Pacific War. So this staggering amount of people dying in a battle didn't really reflect the importance of the island. But overall, there were a ton of mistakes that the Allies made that did not help the death toll, like coming in on low tide and not doing the best recon before invading. So this probably costed a lot of lives for the Allies that they really needed for the rest of the battle, because this is still pretty early on in the Pacific War. But overall, U.S. commanders learned very important lessons from the Battle of Tarawa that would be applied to future battles, including the need for better reconnaissance, more precise pre-landing bombardment. So that pre-landing bombardment helps the soldiers get on, or the Marines get a foothold on the island. So it kind of gives them a little grace period before the Japanese can collect themselves. More amphibious landing vehicles and improved equipment, along other investments. Better waterproof radios would be developed from this battle. Overall, this battle was very brutal, and it was nonstop fighting for 3 days with a very large death toll. This battle set the tone for the Japanese mind to fight until the last man. It showed how hard the war in the Pacific was going to be for the future, and how many lives, just with this small little island, like 3,500 people died, just making a general estimate. And you can really tell how costly and how many lives are going to be wasted just advancing, because this is such a small island and so many people died. So imagine how many islands there are, like in the Philippines, how many people are going to be lost. But overall, Bonito was a important stepping stone for the Allies. This helped their future assaults in the Pacific. So this is a good example of how to attack, but things just need to be cleaned up better. This is my works cited. And thank you for listening to my presentation of the Battle of Tarawa.